Please welcome now to the stage Bambang Susantono, Vice President for Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development at ADB, and Michael Rattinger, Climate Change Specialist at the ADB. Now we're going to drill more deeply into the report. We're going to look at some of the regional priorities, some of the roadblocks and the potential solutions, and we'll bring in one or two on some of the detail by all means. Now, prior to joining the ADB, Bambang Susantono was the Vice Minister of Indonesia's Ministry of Transportation and Deputy Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development, so clearly an enormous amount of frontline experience. Michael Rattinger joined the ADB in 2012 and works on climate change related issues, focusing mainly on climate finance, policy and strategy. And before joining the ADB, Michael worked as a climate change economist with the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, and previously worked in various capacities on energy, environment and climate change projects globally. So a wealth of experience with the two gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you. The numbers, 26 trillion, are huge, and it may only be 6% of GDP, but getting from where we are now to 26 trillion between now and 2030 seems like an enormous task. Realistically, is it possible? Can it be done?
I think, first of all, the amount itself is a reflection of the growing economy of Asia Pacific. And it's only about 5.9% of the GDP. And as you know, for example, in 1991, most people in Asia Pacific, about 90%, is still categorized as a low income at the time. That was in 1991. But in the 2015, there's the other way around. 96% of the population of Asia Pacific has been in the middle income status. So meaning that the economy is better off, and it's also reflections of a new demand for infrastructure, which is not only a quantity but also the quality of the services itself. So, still, if you zoom in to the situation in the Asia Pacific, even in country, in regions, as well as in cities, you will see the inequality of services, the infrastructure services that they are dealing with right now. So meaning that they are still dealing with the issues of basic needs of services, basic needs such as the water supply, sanitations, even rural infrastructure access is still there. So on one hand, they have a challenge of how to fulfill the basic needs. On the other hand, they also have to support their economic growth. So in this area that they are really would like to invest more in infrastructure. And if you go to any country in Asia Pacific and asking about the government program, infrastructure is always in the agenda. So is it realistic? Again, our number shows that there is money out there. Of course, we have to not only mobilizing the private sectors, but also doing more sort of like a smart planning in the public sectors, because at the end of the day, public sector is still the key role of infrastructure services, whether it is doing their own budget to develop certain kind of infrastructure, or also important is how they develop, for example, the regulatory framework that can also attract private investment to come there. Yes, one study, for example, shows that the saving potential in Asia Pacific goes beyond the gap that we have. Yes. So money is there, but the challenge for all of us right now is how to bridge between the availability of the fund with the demand of infrastructure that we have. Because as you know, as we all know, infrastructure is capital hungry, right? It's a huge investment. It's a long-term also investment, and also it's an upfront investment. So those are the characteristics of infrastructure that we have to sort of like bridge between the availability of fund on one hand and the demand of today's infrastructure.
Michael, what's made very clear in the report is that there's a price tag associated with infrastructure investments to protect against climate change. And as I read it, two things. There's the reducing emissions, core one, but also climate proofing any infrastructure. Do you sense any reluctance to build climate change into the investment, or is that actually likely to be more of an opportunity?
Well, it goes both ways. I think what happens in Asia Pacific is that for many decision makers, many policy makers, climate change may not fully be on their radar at the moment. And of course, given the shortage of infrastructure and basic development challenges in many countries that Bambang just outlined, it's quite it's quite reasonable that their attention is focused elsewhere. But I think the important message is that development goals are not achievable unless climate is considered. So we're in a situation where we know already that climate change threatens to undermine this development that we want to see in the region. So it should absolutely be part and parcel of what's sort of on decision makers' radar. Now, if you see in the report that these sort of added costs of climate change, which is both, as has been mentioned before, keeping to that Paris Agreement, that 2-degree hard limit, but also climate proofing the financed infrastructure. Those 200 billion, additional financing needed. If you look at just the economics of that, it's actually a very cost-effective investment over time, because if you start investing in low carbon, climate resilient infrastructure today, you can reap benefits quite quickly in terms of, think only of improved air quality that's affecting a lot of Asian cities. So over the short term, the sort of health and economic benefits of investing into clean, resilient technology are apparent. Over time, they manifest themselves through reduced losses in agriculture, that you won't have because of climate change, labor productivity issues that you will not have to such a degree because there will be less heat affecting people and so on. So just looking at that climate piece is actually a very sound investment. Now, to get that message across to decision makers, that's the real challenge.
So there is some work there, isn't there, in terms of elevating it and where it stands in the agenda. Bambang, Rana talked very well, summarised the requirements for getting more money, more public money into infrastructure spend, from tax reform to redirecting subsidies. None of them easy. You've worked in government, and there aren't a lot of domestic votes sometimes in saying we're going to remove your subsidies because we want to build some more roads. Are Asian governments up to this challenge? Is it high enough on their radar screen that these quite substantial shifts in policy are required?
I think it varies from one country to another, but let me first just share with you that there will be 5 factors in the new normal of infrastructure in Asia Pacific. The first one is that most of our member countries are already in the middle income status. Only 2 of the 45 right now is still in the low income, which is the Nepal and Afghanistan. The others already on the middle income status. So meaning that they don't only need not only need about the money, but they're always asking for the knowledge. For example, is this kind of technology is proven already on the marketplace? For example, what is the best practices? What is the bad practices as well that they can learn? They always ask for that kind of questions. Also, they would like to have more interactions with any kind of private investor so that they can tap and learn about the sort of like knowledge transfer that they can have with the interactions with their staff. Second one is that inequality. I already mentioned about this. Disparity is there, disparity in the cities, in the regions, and also between countries. That's the second one. The third one is that some of the countries will facing what we call the demographic changing, the aging society. Japan, Korea, and others already, the developed one already experienced this. But a new country like China, Vietnam, they will also experience this in the near future, 10 years from now, for example. So with this kind of changing in demographic structure, we need a new kind of infrastructure that also can answer this kind of demand. The fourth one is the what we call the technology. Right? Technology, disruption technologies. Right now we are talking about the Internet of Things, for example, using the satellite to access the data and informations, for example, the intelligent transport system, the climate smart agriculture, or are the infrastructure that needs or trying to have a sort of like a new high technology that embedded into the investment itself. And the last one is the climate change. Whether you like it or not, this is the new normal for us. So coming back to your questions again, I think that most countries right now understand about this one. But again, it's for us in ADB is the way that we can package such a thing, combining the knowledge, combining the limited money that we have, and working with the private sectors in order for us to really make things happening on the ground. I think that is the key right now, how to package the assistance in such a way that matches with the demand of each country.
We're going to be looking some more detail about private sector involvement, potential private sector, digital technology and smart cities and smart transport systems a little later. Very much welcome your involvement and questions. Let me first though turn to you, Michael. The climate change component for Western organisations has got to be one of the biggest opportunities, I would imagine. Is that right?
I think so. I mean, you know, it's a problem that I think a lot of Western countries, Western governments are already dealing with. Think only of the infrastructure that's already in existence. So retrofitting all of that, which is a big issue in the UK and in other developed countries. That is an issue that is going to affect Asia increasingly. So looking at how climate impacts on the existing stock of infrastructure, never mind all the new infrastructure that has to be climate-proofed,
yes.
Climate-proofed as well. Obviously, the climate response will require implementation of advanced clean technologies. So this is an area where Western companies, Western expertise, obviously have a track record. I think also there's emerging areas such as the experience with integrated planning, especially on the urban level and so on. So not looking at just sector planning, but overlaying different sectors and seeing how they work together under climate constraints. That's I think something that's going to be demanded a lot. For example, we recently contracted a Western European company that had done a climate adaptation map for a European capital city, to do the same for 6 cities in Asia. So to sort of apply that same approach, because we thought that it was a very sort of robust model to look at climate impact on the level of a city and then recommend infrastructure investment needs, and present those in a way that's understandable and palatable to decision makers. So using those approaches, that can be quite profitable. There's not everything that can be translated, so Asia does have its own particular context. But I think, at least in these examples, I'd probably have to name as climate risk management on the corporate level as well. So managing supply chains, across countries, across regions, is something that major global companies, which are mostly Western, there's a great deal of experience there, I think, or insight that should be transferred over time to the private sector in Asia Pacific.
Okay, thanks. Let's open it up now to the audience for questions. Just stick your hand in the air. We'll bring a microphone around to you. And if you're going to identify your name and organisation, please, Richard.
Thank you. Richard Lillison from GazAsia. Can I pick up on this question of costs and the cost of mitigation, the cost of reinforcement for climate abatement? No mention is mentioned anywhere of the impairment costs. In other words, if the investment is not made, what is the cost, in fact, to the society? What cost is made to government? Here alone in London, we know that bad air quality is costing something like £27 billion a year. I'm sure this is reproduced throughout the world, but never in these balance sheets do you ever see impairment costs, although they've been identified. Does the panel have a view of how and when these costs will be included?
That's a very good point. The cost of not climate proofing, are there numbers on that? And Rana, we might turn to you at some point too, if you've got any sense. But Michael.
I mean, that's not included in this report, but it's definitely
If I could just
please, yeah.
mention, so in the previous, we drew on our previous study, which was just focused on the issue of climate change. And in that, we have a very extensive set of numbers. As Michael was saying, we have numbers on the losses in the agriculture sector, air pollution related diseases. It's quite staggering. And in fact, what our numbers show is that it's exactly what Michael was saying, that initially the costs are high, but by 2030, you start to see the benefits just outweighing the costs. And the trick is, as Michael said, is convincing policymakers to just think of a longer time horizon. Because the moment you start, in all our simulations, the moment you start looking at the period from 2030 to 50, it's absolute no-brainer. you really should be doing this. So those numbers are there. It's just in our previous report with the full details.
Yeah, if I may
Bambang,
add
please,
also
yes.
that we are in ADB is very convinced about that kind of situation of how we have to incorporate the climate change dimensions. And that is why we have the screening process. All of our projects in ADB is screened at entry to know whether it has a sort of like climate impact or not. If there is a sort of like high impact that suspected to be associated with the project, then there will be a new the protocol, special protocol will kicks in to address that kind of situations. And we are also very proud that we are the first MDB, Multilateral Development Bank, that ahead of the climate change, ahead of the Paris Agreement in 2015, we declared that we will double our annual climate finance portfolio to 6 billion in 2020. Michael, you want to add about that?
Well, the issue of sort of, what is the economic rationale for investing now versus not investing, what would be the consequences then? We actually did a number of studies based on sub-regions in Asia since 2009. We've done economic costs of climate change studies that sort of mirror the Stern Review approach. And there it's quite clear that countries which fail to invest in the types of things that we're discussing are necessary, both on the mitigation and adaptation side, are going to face increasing losses in their GDP, which, if you get closer to the end of the century, are actually, quite substantial at 10-12% annual GDP. And things start becoming very serious even before that. So if you don't factor in the damage that climate change is causing, then the discussion around sort of economic growth rates has to be adjusted, because these damage factors can outweigh the annual economic growth. It's just that it's not taken into account.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
If this is the case, why is this not much higher up the political agenda? Because basically, these costs of impairment outweigh any investment costs by a country mile. Why is it we have to have the private sector to force the issue of understanding and adopting issues concerning impairment costs? No political agenda, not even here in the UK or America, has agendas for impairment costs, and it's a dirty word, and I really don't understand why this can't be dealt with at a political level. I am hopeful that with enough information, the Southeast Asian regimes will be able to introduce and do something about this. But it's, would you agree that this has to be politically driven and not driven by the private sector?
I completely agree with you. I mean, that this has to be natural. The climate change dimension has to be embedded into the whole process. And it has to be the people concerned, so that we in ADB have what we call the people-centered infrastructure development process, in which we put the people at the center. So if we put at that kind of approach, then we can sort of like coming into the conclusion that this is a must for all of us, rather than having some political dimension on that. And we do hope that by like event like this, we can share with you the practice that we have in Asia Pacific, including our member countries in the Pacific Island, who is very vulnerable to any kind of climate and disaster risk. Countries like Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, they are very vulnerable on this kind of situation. You can imagine that one cyclone coming and then 30 to 50% of their GDP can just disappear. Right? So again, I think that the necessity is beyond any other doubt in terms of trying to incorporate the climate change into the mainstreaming of development process.
So Michael, the numbers speak for themselves, but in terms of there's a messaging issue here, is there not? Yeah, okay. Next question, please. So.
Hi, Harold Hubam, School of Oriental and African Studies, and I focus on energy and climate policy in Asia Pacific, actually. So, looking at those numbers, from where I'm sitting, I thought the amounts for climate mitigation, adaptation, etc., seem quite small. We know what's needed to get on top of the climate crisis. We need a complete transformation of the power sector. We need transportation, heating, cooling. We're not very good with transportation, heating, cooling in the West either. The power sector we're getting better at. Perhaps that's a question more about methodology and the way you approach this. When you look at the baseline investment for infrastructure and the amount that's already there, and then you have the climate side on top, are you already factoring in plans to transition? Or are you saying the additional amount, which again I think is quite small, is what's needed to help us transition? Because a lot of the investment now and in the next few years is going to go into dirty infrastructure in Southeast Asia particularly, but also other parts of the Asia Pacific. And we know that the nationally determined contributions that have been put forward by countries across the Asia Pacific fall short of what's actually needed to achieve the Paris goal of 2 degrees and the ambition of 1.5 degree. So where are the numbers coming from in terms of what we actually need to transition to a safer future with regards to climate change?
I do want to bring you in methodology, because there's a methodology. Please, yes.
Just very quickly, one of the things that we do in the model, and again, that's that sister companion study, which has all this stuff in much more detail. One of the reasons you don't see larger numbers is that there's an energy efficiency benefit that's also kicking in. So what that does is, in fact, it can be quite dramatic. I do not remember off the top of my head, but I myself, I'm not a climate modeling expert, but it's a set of colleagues who did it, but I was surprised to see how much benefit you do get from just ensuring much more efficiency. Now, you are right that some of these numbers will be larger because of the retrofitting. This is really looking at the forward pipeline, but there is a lot of brownfield stuff. So on that count, yes, I would say that the actual number would be a little higher. I would think, though, that it might not be as much because of that efficiency component is countering it.
Just to complement, so the study focuses on 4 sectors, right? So this is power, transport, water, and sanitation, telecoms. There's obviously more sectors than that, right? So that would add to the bill. But and Rana said this in his opening remarks. You know, one thing is to discuss climate proofing of new infrastructure, which is what this report focuses on, and then there's sort of the system costs of large scale shifts, transformational type efforts that have to be made, which are not incorporated, right? So that's one thing. I think if you see what 2 degrees actually means for the Asia Pacific region, it means a 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, right? And in a region where 2/3 of electricity generation is coal power based. That's going to be a very, very, it's a tough challenge. 90% of the mitigation investments are going to be in power and in transport, right? So huge. And I'm glad that you brought up the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which outline, sort of the, I would say, level of ambition of different countries to tackle climate change as part of national efforts and their adaptation needs. And I agree that they are, still far from what is needed, in terms of adding them all up together and ensuring that, at the end we have 2 degrees or even better, 1.5. But we have to understand that it's an iterative process, right? The NDCs are designed to be more ambitious over time, right? So it's only natural that the first generation of nationally determined contributions seems a little bit immature. And I believe personally that there might be some political economy issues at play. Why should I, as a country, commit to steep emissions cuts if there is no realistic perspective for outside financing, technology, and capacity building support? There's also an issue of equity. We're dealing with not only countries like People's Republic of China, which are making huge investments in renewable energy, which arguably make everyone else's efforts easier in the world because they're depressing the price of some vital technologies. It's a point that's not made very often, but we're dealing with countries, think of islands in the Pacific, who I think can quite credibly claim that they are not responsible for the climate change problem and therefore should not be made to pay for it, right? So there's these issues at play, and if you factor in that major economies, Western economies in the world, don't seem to be pulling their own weight. It seems unfair to demand on developing countries in Asia Pacific to bear the brunt, you know, of having to make these investments. So there's sort of techno-economic issues, but then there's issues of equity and politics as well. But I think it's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you. Tom Sanderson from the Foreign Office here in the UK. I don't know if this is a question for now or later, but the private sector contributions necessary are huge. And how much work is being done at development bank level and at national government level to engage the private sector, and particularly the institutional investors, insurance companies and pension funds, local or international ones, to bring in that private capital? And can national governments and development banks set kind of targets and structure models and deals in ways that can better leverage in this private capital? Can you comment on that, please?
Really interested, we'll get to that too on the next panel. But what work's the ADB doing? Can it do more work, and can it engage national governments?
I think we have our two units. The first one is the OPPP, the Office of Public-Private Partnerships. They're trying to have a deal, sort of like a sweet deal on this, the public and private sort of like PPP models. Second one is the private sectors. In our case, we have the PSOD that also trying to have more working together with the private sectors in terms of the other, you know, sort of like projects from the private angles. I see that right now many countries is trying to set up and trying to have a new sort of like situations or the climate where everything will be on the menu. For example, the first one is that some countries like Indonesia or the Philippines trying to set up the infrastructure fund that will be, you know, complement the private sector in terms of the deal. Some of them also trying to set up the guarantee fund. They're trying to minimize the political risk guarantee. On the projects, you know, sort of like problems that in the past, always the bankability of the project being a questions. Now, some of them are trying to set up new facilities like the PDF, the project development facilities. They're trying to, you know, tackle those kind of problems. Others also would like to have what they call the viability gap funding mechanism. So all the instruments of the sweet deal of a PPP and private sector is trying to be introduced in many countries with the hope that, again, it will match with the private sector appetite for that. But at the end of the day, it's not only the government itself, it's not only the sort of like the government and also the MDB, Multilateral Development Bank, but personally, I would like also to see that the private sector also, to some extent, help and assist this one, meaning that we do have to have a best model projects that really happening on the ground. And for that, perhaps we should lower our sort of like profit level and stuff like that, so that it's more trying to have a case that can be referred by many of them, and then scaling them up in the future so that everybody can be convinced about their situations.
There is a broader issue, is there not, around you know, transparency, compliance, regulation, and that is one of the obstacles that the private sector sometimes has in investing in infrastructure projects. So at a much higher level than individual PPP plans, governments need to do more, do they not?
Yeah, but again, my take on that issue is that let's have the deal first. I mean, let's have the model first, because if you are only talking about some, you know, sort of like deficiency here and there, then there will be not having a close deal. And right now, people would like to have sort of like a model so that they can follow on that kind of situation. So the pro-business environment that has to be there, the transparency and accountability that you mentioned, I think it will follow on. If we have a sort of like a deal that can be presented in such a way that can be a model. One of the projects that we have, for example, on the first climate bond in the Philippines on the TV Macban geothermal project is really something that for us a good model to be put on the showcase as a showcase, because it shows that yes, it can be done like that. And our role in ADB is first of all giving the partial credit guarantee of the project itself, and also having having the cooperations with the private sector in terms of the bond initiatives.
Okay, right. We've time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm Michelle from Kroll. Touching on the issues on the compliance that you just brought up, and also Pa Bambang mentioned about the guarantee fund. So will the guarantee fund from the government to support the private will also cover like the fraud and corruption risk, which is very imminent in the Asian countries? Thank you.
Very tricky questions. I think most of them are dealing with the political risk rather than those kind of risks that you mentioned, right? Political risk is the one that's very difficult to handle by the private sectors, and a sweet deal means that the risk is being mitigated by the proper units or the proper parties that can handle that one. So what we are seeing at this point is that those kind of political risk guarantee is the one that being tackled by MDBs and also the special unit in the government. But for the more commercial one, I think that the one that us in ADB is also have our compliance and safeguard that deal with that kind of issues. But beyond that, I believe that it's a commercial transactions that we have to apply all those principles that we used to have in the marketplace.
Okay. We'll explore that more in our next panel. I'm afraid, gentlemen, we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Bambang Susantono and Michael Rattinger. Please join me in thanking them for their insights.